Hello, everybody, and welcome to our conversation series on seeking harmony. Today, we are looking at a few topics that has been newsworthy for us in this week that we feel are worth exploring a bit further. And so one of the things that was a standout was the move within Europe to consider regulating or capping gas prices, which would then also mean that electricity prices, which it's linked to, are not as high. And we felt it was topical given that an energy crisis for Europe at this stage in the year would be a greater challenge given that they're going into much colder months. We've also seen some changes in LGBTQ legislation and repealing of certain penal codes in, I think it was, what was it? Last time it was Singapore, now there's something within Cuba and Vietnam that we believe is also quite topical. And then Isaiah is also doing a lot of work around housing for what I would say is previously disadvantaged, but I'll let him explain the work that they're doing and some of the challenges and issues that come up through the work and how they overcome them in the process. So I'm going to open it up to the team and ask that maybe one of you shares which topic you feel is most top of mind for you, and then we can go from there.
Liv, I felt to first talk about the changes that the European countries want to make to the pricing of gas and electricity. And yeah, I thought it was interesting because I feel like it kind of shows how their energy market, like their whole production of electricity and energy is so dependent on natural gas, and Europe has been really dependent on, not totally, but really dependent on Russia for natural gas, and how Russia, like cutting off some of that supply, really like increases the prices of gas. And you know, it was interesting. And so I was reading about it, and it sounded like, so I didn't quite understand this system that they had, and maybe someone can explain more, but it said that so the different like energy suppliers, it said, what I read said they bid into the market to supply electricity. So I assume that means like making a bid, like paying money in order to have the right to sell their energy supplies to European grids. I don't know, I didn't understand, but apparently it ends up that after the renewable energy producers, the people who end up supplying a lot of the electricity are those who supply natural gas. And that's why like natural gas is said to like set the price of electricity, because a lot of that electricity ends up being produced by natural gas. So I thought that was interesting. And I just wanted to know if I got that right or what that means, because I'm not super familiar with that whole like system they have.
Right, so I'm not really familiar either. And I don't want to go into something that is too technical, because I don't like, you know, not an expert on that. But oh, she's not there anymore. Yeah, she'll come back. Okay. Just a technical difficulty. Sync. Okay, so yeah, I think it's a sign to like release the technical thoughts and go directly into the topic. Yeah, I find that it's quite surprising, obviously, because like for many like, you know, resources like oil and gas and electricity, they're given in our market and society today. And so it's not every day that it's not every day that you see like big countries saying like, oh, right, there's a crisis there and we need to, oh, there she is. We need to, you know, do something. Yeah, Sage, we were saying that maybe it was a thing to not go into technical details.
Yeah.
Just go directly into the topic.
Yeah, I don't know them anyway, so there you go. But yeah, it is interesting, and I felt like it was interesting because I feel like they're trying to like if the prices could just like keep going up and up and up, that companies could charge. And it's a case where the people are thinking about and asking for there to be like regulations on it so that, you know, so that people can make it through the winter much more comfortable.
Yeah, definitely. So what I know about it is that, you know, resources, these companies have been trying to expand like their production for years now, I think like since 2015. And we've seen a consistent rise of the prices of electricity and gas. And with the promise that when the production would be like much more stable, like prices would be stable as well and even diminish. But like last winter was so bad that they had to do like power cutouts. I did in France in some regions because there wasn't enough like resources. I think it was around the beginning of the war with like Russia. There was a scare like on the reserves, like things like that. And I think what the I wasn't about to speak about that, but I guess that's what's coming up. What the Ukrainian war is like highlighting is, I guess it's accelerated the process of realizing that this system of production and rise of the prices is not sustainable for anybody, not sustainable financially and not sustainable economically. And for me, it's almost like a blessing in disguise. I don't know. You know, it's like it saves us like years of like asking when the prices will be more regulated and how this you know, economy could be stable again, and makes people look quicker into like alternative like ways of producing these resources, instead of like having this system of like producing, prices increasing, and then in the meantime like buying from one or two suppliers in the world, like, you know. But yeah, I'm not an expert on that, so maybe there's something that I'm missing, but you know, as a European, that's, you know, the feeling that I have. And I think it's very parallel to President Biden's like intention of having like more alternative solution inside the US to supply for these natural resources. So yeah, I don't know what you guys feel about that.
Yeah, that's really interesting that what you're saying, that like it was actually a problem before, the war in Ukraine started. So yeah, that's good to know. And it makes a lot of sense, like it makes a lot of sense looking at like Vladimir Putin, like why he would like target, you know, natural gas in Europe, like why he would try to use that, against Europe. But yeah, it's good to know though that like that was already a problem. Like it's not just like isolated to the war, and that, the old infrastructure, the old way of doing the power system is already like not working out. Yeah.
So my concern with how this is playing out is there's already sanctions in terms of Russia's interaction with various other countries in terms of the supply of these natural gases. And then he goes and regulates and diminishes the supply even more. It kind of just feels to me like it's a very economic move. So you're not taking much, so we're going to supply less, but at a higher price, because you still need it and you still want it, but kind of our coffers are getting emptier, so we have to push up the price to kind of fuel our war machine again. So I feel like it's a very strategic play. It's literally, my sense is a game of cat and mouse here. So there's definitely an economic motive behind how Russia is choosing to limit the supply and also increase the price of that supply, given that there's such a big supplier within Europe. Also, Europe is at the stage where they don't have the luxury of really sticking to their guns too much, because otherwise their populations freeze. Like European winters are rather uncomfortable, and they just get more and more uncomfortable the more and more cold it gets. So like, it's very much a loaded gun situation, and it's not even a game of Russian roulette where there's one round in a chamber of 6. This is literally a loaded gun. It's like a full, literally a full, what do you call this thing? Full.
What is that thing called? Not the magazine, because when
the magazine, it's a full magazine. It's not one shot in a rolling in a chamber of 6, and you kind of, it's the luck of the draw. This is like literally, it's a loaded gun, and whether you choose to pull the trigger or the trigger is pulled, there's still going to be a shot fired, and there's still going to be a casualty. And it feels like he's playing the game of, well, you cannot continue down this road because you are inadvertently causing your own countries to suffer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it just really keeps bringing up the importance of like being careful about what countries you develop those interdependencies with and the relationships there, because Russia has been like acting tyrannical for a while, and Europe hasn't always wanted to disinvest from Russia, even regardless of them invading Georgia and Ukraine earlier. But I think now it just kind of brings it more to a head, and it encourages Europe to like think more strategically or be more selective of like what countries they're interdependent with and how much so. So, and not to not like give power to abuse or potential give fuel to an abuser who gives you fuel. So,
and you know, the interesting part is that they play in two very major markets. They play in a natural gas market and they play in a grain market. It's literally two things that, in their absence, could be apocalyptic. It's almost as if they are single-handedly starting off an apocalypse.
well, that would be, yeah, I mean, that would probably be the intention, you know, but yeah, I feel like there are always ways around it. And if people persist through it and have faith and just don't give up, then they can find ways around it. But yeah, I think that's like the intention.
Yeah, and I agree with you that that persistence will eventually yield a result. But in the short term, this is going to yield more damage, even if it spurs people into thinking much more innovatively about food and fuel supplies.
Maybe some countries like more so than others, because this article was basically written on like the Belgium prime minister's words, you know. And obviously we see like other countries playing out this strategy, like Germany going into like alternative resources, even though they have a big reserve. But yeah, definitely highlights that a change for some, and I guess an urgency for others. There's something that, like, you know, that strikes me in this is that the intention to end the indexation, I guess, of like electricity on gas, you know. And I think the last time, if I'm not mistaken, something similar happened was like between the world wars when dollar was stopped. Dollar's indexation on gold was stopped. And so to me, it feels like, you know, in the eve of a crisis, like there's a big like decision, a choice to have an economic, I guess, an economic change, like a big economic change, you know, and a way to rethink our economy and our market, which is interesting. And it's also saying that, right, you know, if Russia tries to corner us into lack of natural resources, like we have ways to get out of it, and we won't play, as you said, like we won't play the same game, and won't be, I guess, won't be cornered, won't be let cornered.
So I think it's a lofty ideal to say we won't be cornered at this point in their lives, but we also know that necessity breeds innovation. So the more desperate the situation is, the more clever people become about finding alternatives and implementing them. So it might be a catalyst under these circumstances to achieve something more and to put resources behind actually exploring clean energy. But at the same time, in the short term, there is unfortunately a little bit of being backed into a corner. And what generally happens when somebody is backed into a corner, they retaliate in one of two ways. They either fight or they flee, because it triggers a survival response being backed into a corner.
Yeah, and I think some of the creativity that might come out is how to get natural gas from like the United States to Europe more. I read that like one problem with that was that the gas would come, I'm assuming, in like these giant tanks, and European countries like didn't have a lot of machines that could hook up to those giant tanks and like take the gas out of them. So it's literally like the infrastructure is not built to receive gas except by these like land-based pipelines, you know, which all come from Russia pretty much. And so that was interesting. And so it's an area where maybe they could, I don't know, get creative and find a way to do that, or just maybe build or bring some of those machines that are needed to unload gas packed in these big tanks. I don't know. I was reading that and I was like, couldn't that be changed, you know, or something like that? I mean, maybe it would be a big investment. I don't really know. But yeah, I feel like it's there's an opportunity there to yeah, you know, be more connected, have more connection with America and like other suppliers, you know, of gas. So.
Yeah, so I like that, and again, I like how you're looking at the picture and saying there's a potential solution. We also need to be cognizant that Europe doesn't have significant trade ports, and the trade ports that are significant are also blocked by Russia. You know, that's
which ones?
Pardon?
Russia's blockading European ports.
Well, the Balkans. That's like a major trade. Well, a major port. It's a major shipping route. And so, like, if you look at what Europe is, a lot of it is landlocked over vast distances. And that's why it probably necessitated these massive oil pipelines and gas pipelines. And even transporting from various ports to those countries probably is going to require a lot of infrastructure movement, specifically in the form of tankers, in the form of truck tankers. And then, you know, also, like, I don't know if gas is actually moved in that way. Fuel, I know, could be moved in that way. I'm not so certain about the gas component, or the gas component has to kind of be placed into containers and then moved, you know. So the logistics around it become very interesting to consider, and that's why I believe that necessity will definitely breed innovation, because there is a requirement to get smarter about how these things are moved, but it's also a requirement for the countries affected to probably collaborate with each other a lot more in order to enable that movement.
Yeah, because like if you take part of Europe, it's like the size of the whole of the United States. And we have like big ports. I'm thinking about like Rotterdam in the Netherlands and Le Havre in France. But like the logistics of going to countries, from countries to countries, instead of like going into one big country, even though it's divided in like regional states, is like obviously way more complicated. So yeah, I guess that you can't really compare like the way like energy is brought into different regions in the United States and in Europe. So there's definitely going to be a lot of change, and I guess there are a lot of innovations on that, I guess, in Europe already. But like, as I said at the beginning, I think it's going to be accelerated by the crisis, as you said, like crisis
needs to be accelerated.
Crisis beats innovation.
It's going to need to be accelerated exponentially. It can't just follow normal acceleration processes. It's kind of going to need to be ramped up quite quickly and quite urgently for the need that it will actually need to cover. The need is going to grow, not diminish over the next few months.
Mhm. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Well, that's my perception of it anyway. I feel like
Oh yeah.
there's definitely going to be require a lot of ramped up work, and a lot of cooperation and collaboration is going to be required to secure all of those countries that are affected by these gas prices, and the gas that naturally then also is used to produce electricity. Otherwise, you're breaking the economies of countries, you're breaking the household standard of living in countries.
Mhm. There's definitely going to be a lot of change, and I'm curious to see how it's going to unfold, and definitely the collaboration side that was mentioned. Yeah. All right. It was like a natural hand and transition to another topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's see. So we were talking about the housing difficulties, I guess, or housing crisis in the US. You're also talking about Cuba, like wanting to change, considering changing its laws on same-sex marriage, and Vietnam also changed some of its policies toward homosexuality. So do we want to talk about Isaiah, do you want to talk about the housing thing now, or do you want to go into the LGBT territory? What shall we do?
Feels good to do LGBT and then housing. Does that feel good to you guys?
Yeah, I'm on that page as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so now taking a stroll down the Rainbow Road. So obviously last week we were talking about in Singapore, the government is looking to decriminalize same-sex sexual relations. St. Kitts and Nevis, the Caribbean island St. Kitts and Nevis, its high court recently ruled, it struck down a law criminalizing homosexuality. So that happened in the Caribbean. Also in the Caribbean, Cuba, late September, they're going to vote on a new family code. It's a referendum, so all the Cuban citizens can vote. And in it, it will say that same-sex marriage and civil unions are allowed. So if they approve it, then that'll be allowed. And yeah, I also wanted to mention too, because there's just a lot of like LGBTQ stuff going on that's progressive. And in Vietnam, the health ministry announced that conversion therapy is banned. So like, trying to make a gay person straight. And they said that they no longer classify homosexuality as being a disease. So that was something that there are countries that still are like that. Yeah, I know it can seem shocking, but it used to be like really a firmly held belief. And the fact that it's changing is very like liberating for people, and that conversion therapy is being banned. Although I read that they don't have any like means or like extra means or people to enforce that ban, but it's at least their policy. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting shift, and something that, because as I read the topics that you recommended, just my sense was like, well, has Cuba not necessarily been one of the more controlling, suppressing countries? And so I did go and look at some of their history, and literally, I mean, they only really decriminalized same-sex sexual relations in like 1979, 1980. But before that, there was a significant amount of persecution around same-sex relations in the first place. And Also, what's interesting is, as you said, that, they're legalizing same-sex marriage and civil unions, but they're also allowing same-sex couples to adopt kids. And so it's a massive shift that on one hand feels like a good win, but on the other hand also feels like it's left up to chance with a referendum, because you don't always know the sentiment of every single person, every single voter in a country. And so it feels like it could still fall to either side of this little divide at this point. Like, and until the result is in, it could very well still be, depending on who turns up to actually vote in this referendum, it could just perpetuate the status quo. And one of the things that was shared, well, one of the things that I read was that there is very much still in the more rural areas within Cuba, there's still a great sentiment against same-sex couples and same-sex marriage and that kind of stuff. It's more the metropolitan type areas that have shifted their perspective on being more accepting and more inclusive. So it's still very much, for me, yes, it's a great step in the right direction, but I also still feel like it's very much in the air. Like there's no real clarity until the result of that referendum is seen.
Yeah, and I guess we have to completely surrender here and accept that whatever is going to happen will be the choice of the people. Like for a country, the people will speak, and we can do much against it or about it. But like something that strikes me again is like we were talking about this divide and how like one country decides to move towards like inclusivity of the LGBTQ movement, and one country moves the other way. And it just reminded me of a conversation we had with Jeff about like countries. I don't remember what conflict we were talking about, but it was like countries are basically choosing sides, and it's very much like, we're at this stage where it's a definitive choice for everyone. It's either you're choosing heaven or you're choosing not love, basically something else. And yeah, it's like we're seeing the polarization of choices and polarizations of conflicts and anything going to the extreme on topics that we're used to seeing on the news, because like the energy is moving towards like make a choice now, and what will this choice be? And so yeah, at first I was kind of shocked that we had so much like topics and countries where there was a very vivid debate on like LGBTQ rights and same-sex relationships and marriage still, and how it was all coming up at once. But I guess it's that it's like the push, the energetical, I guess, push to make a choice.
Yeah.
Something interesting that I read that I just wanted to share quickly before you say, was, I read something that said healing is the beginning of the end of the conflict with yourself. And I kind of just feel like there's a lot of conflict that's kind of coming up to be healed. It's like literally a choice in consciousness to really surface all of those conflicts in order to encourage more healing at a conscious level.
Yeah, I feel like it would be hard for a lot of societies not to want to weigh in on these questions when like so many other countries and societies are considering them, like questions of big cultural import. And what's happening with Cuba, I think is really is interesting and cool because, it kind of adds some nuance to what you're talking about with like the world being like, basically, are you on the side of like tyranny and oppression and, uh, darkness, or are you on the side of like freedom, and prosperity? Because, Cuba, like a lot of countries that are kind of against the world order that includes like the US, and the EU, they are saying like, oh, culturally, we prefer what's traditional. So they're going back to like the quote unquote traditional ways of, well, I guess in ancient times, people just kind of pillaged and conquered, and if they had the strength, they would just try to take a country over and pillage it, and that's what Russia's doing with Ukraine, and China considering with Taiwan, or there's Russia saying we stand for traditional values, so heterosexuality and everything like that, and we're opposing the West. So it's kind of like this big ideological contrast where these countries are saying, listen, are you with us or are you with them over there? Like, are you with those weirdos over there? And there's like some contention within all countries, right, about this. Although if it's an authoritarian regime, there's not going to be as much of a conversation. Whereas in the US, there's like a big conversation. But Cuba is interesting because like Cuba is one of those countries that it will vote with Russia, China, and Iran, and those countries, and North Korea, like those countries that tend to stand for, tyranny or oppression. Like Cuba will vote with them a lot in the UN. So, but we're seeing that culturally, there's a huge consideration of acceptance that's coming up in Cuba. I read that in some polls, like it was like 63% of Cubans surveyed said that they did approve of same-sex marriage, and that there's you know what I mean. So that's a movement of reducing oppression, because it's not just oppression of gay people, right? Like you're policing everyone. It's based on some idea of like how men should be and how women should be, and trying to control people. Just the idea alone that you can control people like that is oppressing everyone. But the fact that I'd be reconsidered in Cuba, I feel, is a move toward freedom. So it's kind of interesting because Cuba has not always been on that side, in certain ways. It just really depends. What do you guys think?
You bring up a very, very good point, because like Cuba is like historically, it's on the side of communism. So historically, it will support like Russia and China, even though they've not always had the best relationships. And like on paper, Cuba has a socialist regime. So they will stand with their historical allies, but they've always had these cultural differences. And I guess like it's just like the mix up, the Caribbean, Caribbean, whatever, that cultural mix up that pushes them towards like progression, like best healthcare in the world and good education for everyone else, and always like these progressive sides. But as you said, they're always like going back and forth, it seems, energetically. And so maybe that's the choice for them. It's like, right, like it's time to pick sides, Cuba. Make a decision for good and pick a side, because like basically like you you will have to. Who do you ally with? Like, who do you? Because like sometimes they feel more aligned with like China, and sometimes they feel more aligned with Egypt and Indonesia. And sometimes they feel kind of cordial to the United States, and sometimes it feels like more separated. But like it's never a definite line with Cuba, it seems. And it feels like when you observe that, you're like, how is it that it's so progressive on one side and culturally so rich and doing all these things and still supporting tradition in some ways? It's such a contradiction, and they will have to heal that, basically. And I think like many Caribbean people and Caribbean countries will have to heal that, because there's that contradiction between like progressive and tradition that shows up in different ways for everyone, but that is still there and very much felt. And the world is like, right, it's time to make a decision, because we won't support you if we don't know which side you are on. Like, and it's okay. Like, it's a universe giving them a push to grow, hopefully. So yeah, that's my Caribbean take on things.
You know, it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because like as you were explaining that, it kind of feels in the background energy kind of felt like an energy of confusion, like you don't really know what you stand for. Like, pick a stance. More than picking a side is pick a stance, like draw your line in the sand and have the courage of your convictions. It's like literally like a really tall tree swaying in any direction that the wind kind of blows, and it doesn't sound like a very decisive stance, even if there's progression. So it's kind of like we will err on the side of where we're going to get where we derive the most perceived benefit at any given time, which feels like very much a game of politicking. It's a game. It feels like a game of politics. Like, let's stick with the perceived stronger force at any given time, and not quite stand for something. So I agree with you that there's a definite drive and a different desire and consciousness for just much stronger clarity, even just from an individual level, spilling right up into a national level, into a global level. Like, there's a lot of cry for clarity, for stability. And so you will see it playing out in these various things that make you go like, okay, from a Caribbean point of view, like it's too much floaty. Kind of needs to be a bit more of a stronger, upright, standing, spined process than kind of the great amount of flexibility could probably not benefit them in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like too, though, it kind of does make sense, because like there's a lot of contradictions in the whole movement of communism itself. Like, I feel like the idea was like communism was supposed to be like liberatory and, you know, progressive and all of this when it was first.
Sorry, is my understanding of communism and your understanding of communism the same?
I guess it's Marxism,
like
because it's based
Marxism.
on Marxist texts about like a new world and a progressive world.
I mean,
which is the ideal.
Yeah, that might be I mean, I don't know. Like, there might have been a different intention with Karl Marx, and things clearly didn't turn out that way. But I feel like that's, and at least in communist propaganda too, like, I mean, people see that and they might be like, oh, that sounds great, let's sign up. And then it ends up just being a repressive dictatorship. But there's at least that idea, you know, of liberation of people. And it really contrasts with like the authoritarian, totalitarian way that quote unquote communist movements like unfolded. So that in itself is a contradiction that I bet Cuban society has had to grapple with. And also the fact that so many Cubans live in the US, like so many Cubans live in like Florida in particular, there's probably like a lot of like communication or interchange between the groups, I would think. And it's just, they're so close to the US, it's just so interesting because culturally it's hard to be so like distinct when so many of your country's people have fled or immigrated one way or another, you know, out of your country to like a more, well, to a democratic one.
Yeah. I guess it really depends because a lot of Cubans in Florida voted for Trump in like 2016, and the feeling that it gave was, and when you heard them speak in the news, was like, we chose the United States because we don't agree anymore with what Cuba is, and we chose like capitalism and democracy and things like that, and many other things, but basically it's like the idea that Jeff and Shaleia highlighted that if you don't agree with your country, you should just leave it. So at heart, they're Cuban, of course, but like their country of choice is the United States. So I don't know if their energy plays out that much in the choices of like Cuba internally right now. But there's definitely a complex situation, and again, curious of like the future choices that are going to be made.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like it's a good time to move on to Isaiah sharing some of the work that he's doing in the last 15 minutes of our conversation.
Yeah, sure. So I can just share. So what I do for work kind of just highlights the housing crisis in America, and just there's a different, you can see it differently in each state, but there is just a general national housing crisis going on. So I currently work at a homeless shelter, and I work with individuals and families. So what I see, and I can just speak on like the bigger systemic issues that I see. It's very obvious that the problem is just housing in general, because there's no regulation or cap on pricing for housing. Like one bedroom right now, the average in Denver is over 1,700, which is a lot. And then there's also just like, for example, in Denver, where that's where we live, it's really exaggerated because there's such a high population here. Like so many people have come to Colorado and to Denver in recent years, and there's just not enough housing. Like there's just for example, with the population I work with people experiencing homelessness, there's not enough shelters, and there's not enough places for people to go just to be off the streets in general. But then looking for affordable housing, there's just so few options. So yeah, that's just kind of the what I see for like the housing crisis in America that's going on right now. And also what just came up is like you could even be working like a minimum wage job 40 hours a week and still not be able to afford, like a 1-bedroom apartment. And that's just shouldn't be the case. Yeah, so that's just like some barriers there too. But Yeah, so that's happening in America.
So something that stood out for me, the stuff that you shared even in our chat on Discord, was also the fact that there was quite a move of, for lack of a better phrasing, property developers coming in to buy up the lower end of properties and then pushing up rental and that kind of stuff. So it kind of feels like it's very much a problem of design, but
Yes.
that design is fueled by a level of greed. Would you kind of say that that's your sense of it as well?
Oh yeah, it sucks. It's like everyone for themselves, whatever they can buy up, like, because there's so many like housing and apartment complexes right now. I think we read in that article, it said 1 in 5 properties are being bought by investors or larger companies, and then they can just do whatever the hell they want with the prices. They can and yeah, so we're seeing prices there just skyrockets because, yeah, like you said, it's fueled by greed, like people just wanting to take what they can get, and yeah, like, and having no regulation on it.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to a very important component, is the issue of regulation. Because again, I mean, it's something that we also spoke about in terms of our conversation around the property crisis in Singapore. And again, it goes back to the fact that property is probably seen as one of the better investment vehicles, because property doesn't generally depreciate over time, over maintenance, over renovation. Property actually appreciates, but it grows in value. And so it's definitely a greater investment vehicle, but it feels like this investment vehicle is kind of almost being used at the expense of people that are in the lower end of the market that already cannot afford the bare minimum.
Exactly.
Sorry, I'm curious to know, like, what has been done since like 2008, because like the global crisis started with like the housing market in not necessarily Denver, but like the United States, like the east of the United States. And we're still seeing like I guess a cycle of crisis in the United States. Like, for example, during COVID, we saw like cases of abusive evictions of people during COVID-19. And it was like, well, what is being done? Like, is there a federal law protecting these people? Like, why in this state we're hearing like a housing crisis, and then 2 years later in this state we're hearing a different housing crisis, and what is being done for them? Like, it's just something I'm curious. I'm not sure if you can answer this, but I think it's worth asking, like, what has changed, and has the administration put enough attention into solving this problem?
There's been some effort to like not to discourage people from like borrowing beyond their means for houses, like trying to take something, bite off more than they can chew, for sure. Just in my conversations with people, because I used to talk to people all the time about this kind of stuff. It came up all the time in my conversations when I would do like commercial driving. People would say like, yeah, nowadays you've got to put like a 20% down payment on some houses and stuff, like a huge, enormous down payment, and stuff like that. Or they're like, oh, the interest rate is, much higher. So like those are like some standard mechanics that will like raise the threshold of like, not not somebody needs to be like extremely well qualified for buying a house, you know. I don't know if that's happened everywhere, if it's that stayed the same, you know, in recent years, but that definitely happened where the threshold was made higher. But I'm not really sure though about the market overall, like, because one thing that makes things difficult is if the threshold is really high to buy a home and the supply is also low, that just raises prices a lot. And I'm not really sure what's being done there, because if housing is being seen as just like an investment and a way to make money, and it's not being, the purpose of it is for people to be able to like live, you know, and have shelter, and for it to support them in doing their, living their life, doing their purpose ultimately. And I don't know if that's being honored exactly, so I don't know, but yeah. And do you guys have anything to add about that?
Yeah, it's like a little bit of an imbalance. I'm not going to compare countries, but in like France, you have a law for down payment, minimal down payment. Also have a law for in big cities to regulate prices so that it doesn't go up too quickly because it's so high in demand. And we still have a crisis even with that. And so with not having this side of the balance in some big cities in the United States, it still feels like there's, you know, ways to have imbalances and ways to have a crisis on your hand still.
Yeah, and it's something else that probably stands out is like, I know, like, yes, we probably don't have it, right? But there's also a component in South Africa where there are developments of low-cost housing. And so that is definitely something that's worth a consideration if, you know, if it's because it literally becomes government subsidized, it becomes land subsidized, tax subsidized. So there's all those things that have an impact. But I think there is a level of regulation as well, but specifically in terms of building low-cost housing as opposed to generally regulating the ability of people to charge what they want to charge. Also, we probably per capita have more houses in South Africa than we have these significant high-rise apartments and those kind of things. They happen in certain major cities, but there's much more housing. But there's also places where there's a lot of informal settlements. So people have just gone up and put up their own little shacks, and these have developed into little areas and little residential areas. So there's also that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think it's probably an opportunity for us to explore housing as a topic in a future conversation, because it sounds like there's genetic challenges all over the place, but those genetic challenges seem to connect us all in some way or another. So I think it's probably something that we should explore in a future conversation. But for now, I'm going to say thank you to everybody for today's conversation. We have reached our hour. And so to everybody that's followed us and joined us, thank you. And please feel free to like and subscribe to our Church of Union YouTube channel. And we will see all of you again next week. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.